Let's talk about the web browser object in Wyz Create. I'm going to give the back of this page just a little bit of color so that we can see items on top of it a little bit more easily. So I've got this web browser object that I've just added to my page. By default, it's got CNN on there. You can see that that's auto-filled with this URL property here on the web browser. So a couple of things to point out. When entering in a web browser object, it is best to include the protocol before the web address. And what that means is this specific part right here, http://, and in some instances it would be HTTPS. If you were to add in a new website there, all you need to do is type on the other side of those //. There are some instances where if you didn't include that protocol, the website would not load. And that's why it's a good practice to just include it in there. Again, that's only some instances, not all of them. Another thing to keep in mind is that on iOS here, which is how I'm working right now, I can look at any website on here. It's also worth noting, I'm going to clone this so that we have a couple of different options here. I want to plug in a different web address to the second one and show you just the differences here. So I've got wyzcreate.com on one. Let's do Amazon on this one, see what happens. So that one works. I'm going to clone there to get a third one. And I'll drag that down here. I'm going to use Wikipedia on this next one. Okay. And one more. On this next one, I'm actually going to use the web browser object for a video. So we do have, in the object menu, we do have a video object, but what that pulls from is videos that you can put in from either My Media or the media library. So for instance, in the media library, we have a bunch of videos preloaded that you could pull from. So if I say sunset time lapse, that's a preloaded video and it's actually a video file. Let's say you wanted to use a YouTube video. The video object is not what you should use for that. You should use a web browser object, and we're going to put in the URL for a video. But specifically, I'm not going to use the direct URL for a video. I'm actually going to use the embed URL. So here's what I mean by that. I'm actually going to pull up our channel here on Wyz Create. Okay, so I've got a video pulled up here. So I want to point out there's two different URLs for this video. There's this URL here. But if I were to paste this into the web browser object, swiping back over to Wyz Create, what's going to show up is the page that the video is on YouTube. And when I save this, you're going to see that it automatically starts playing the video in a way that I can't interact with. So you can see the page here, you can see the video playing. If I tap, it's just bringing up the properties and the web browser editor.
Welcome to Wyz Create. My name's Amanda, and I'm going to be of knowledge to build whether games, business apps, educational tools, websites, and so much more. Before we jump in, I want to point out that Wyz Create is a growing platform. My name's Amanda, and I'm going to itself. You might notice changes to the platform, but core concepts of this lesson will remain unchanged.
Okay, so I just illustrated there that there's a couple things going on. It autoplays in development mode, and then it also autoplays in run mode. I can only interact with the player controls of the video in run mode, and they're playing on top of each other. It's a little bit frustrating. So here's how to get around that. I'm going to swipe back over to YouTube, and I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to tap this share button here under the video. Within the share button, there is an embed option, and if you tap there, you're going to see an embed code. So if you had a website that you wanted to place an embedded video onto, you would copy and paste this entire code here and paste it into the code of your website. However, the web browser object on Wyz Create is essentially already an iframe, taking care of most of this coding here. So all we need is this specific URL right here, and we need to copy and paste that into the web browser object. So I'm going to right click and say copy, or you could Command C. And then I'm going to swipe back over to Wyz Create, and I'm going to paste that URL into the web browser object. When I do, you can see what results is a full screen video embedded here in this web browser object. In development mode, there is no auto playing. I can't play the video from here. Tapping it here just brings back up the web browser object's editor and its properties for me to edit there. And then when I go into run mode, so I can interact with that here. I can see the controls here and some of the pop-ups. Okay, so this is looking at this web browser object example compilation here in iOS. What I want to do is actually share this to the web. I'm going to upload it to the cloud, and I want to show you the difference of web browser objects once they're in the cloud and in an HTML app. So I'm going to open Wyz Create on my browser. Okay, so here I have Wyz Create open on my browser and I have opened that app on HTML. So I want you to notice that the only web browser object that is still functioning correctly is that video embed. Now the Wikipedia one typically would work here, so let's see what's going on there. Okay, so I'm just going to pull from Wikipedia's featured article today. I'm going to update the URL in this Wikipedia browser here, so that's a specific Wikipedia page. Now I'm going to share this back to the cloud and see what happens. Okay, so you can see that the only two web pages here that are working are the Wikipedia page and the video embed. The reason for that is that most sites, modern sites today, have security clauses that block their site from being embedded in another website. So WizCreate.com is one of those, Amazon.com is one of those. Most websites do that. Wikipedia does not, and there's a handful of others. And also the specific embed video URL from YouTube will not block that. So keep that in mind. It really depends on the output of the app that you're making. If it's only going to be used on iOS, maybe you can get away with using a traditional website there. But otherwise, you may need to push to the cloud, test in HTML, and double check that what you expect to be working is actually working if your output is planned for a web app. So back in Wyz Create, I want to point out a couple of other things, and that's that this Wikipedia page is a little bit hard to read right now. So I do want to point out that you could make, I'm going to delete these others that don't work in HTML just for the sake of illustration here. You could use this web browser object much larger, much easier to read and digest what's going on there. You could also make it full page, same with a video. So for instance, if I had this placed at 0, 0 for location of the X and Y coordinates and 100, 100 for width and height, you can see that it takes up the full page now. Because it takes up the full page, I can now only get to the page editor through the settings and pages tab, and then find page number 1 there that way. I'm going to hide this video web browser, and I'm going to run the app just to show what happens as I explore this Wikipedia page. So I can close this and I can use this like any typical Wikipedia page, but you can notice as I'm clicking through things here, I don't have any way to get back to the page that I was on. So there's something you can do within the web browser objects property, this toggle that says show controls. If you turn that on, you can see controls show up at the top of the page here, both in development mode and run mode. So there is one key script associated with web browser objects. So to illustrate that, I'm going to add a button to the page here. And so this button is associated with the red backed. Okay, so some minor changes to this button. This button here is going to be associated with the page that you see right now. So I'm going to go into this page and I'm going to copy that URL that we've used already. And I'm going to go into this button again and into scripting. When button is touched, I'm going to go to animation and set properties. And I'm looking for a script that says set web browser URL here. So this needs to know which browser we need to set, which actually, let me go into here and rename these because I haven't done that yet. This will be my Wikipedia page. And then my other one, we'll name video. So back into the scripting of this button, when button is touched, I want to set the web browser named Wikipedia to this URL. So that actually won't change anything right now because that's what the URL already is. But let's clone this button. And pick a new article back on that Wikipedia page. How about Scotland? So I'm going to copy this URL. I'm going to rename this button to Scotland. I'm going to change its title to Scotland Info. And I'm going to go into that script when button is touched to set the web browser URL of that exact same browser to this URL instead. So now when I run my app, tapping this doesn't do anything because that's what it already is. But if I tap Scotland info, you can see the web browser object changes to Scotland. I can go back to the bird, back to Scotland, back to the bird, and tap done. That same thing works in the video setting. I'm going to turn that web browser named video back on. Okay, I'm going to drag these buttons up. And I'll clone one of them so that we can see how the web browser object with a video embed would operate as well. So I'm going to call this one change video. And just quickly go over back to our YouTube channel and pick a new video. So I'm going to use this other video from our YouTube channel and I'm going to copy its URL using Command C. Swipe back over. On the change video, I'm going to change the title to new tutorial, and then under the scripting, I'm going to set the web browser named video to that new URL. Maybe I specifically want this URL to start at one of these helpful timestamps here. So let's say I wanted it to be specifically about using the speech bubble. So I would want it to start at minute mark 11:40. So if I tap there in my video,
Next up, let's look at adding some
and I go back to share and I say start at 11:41, if I check mark that, you can see that the timestamp there is t = 7:01 and it added a question mark there. If I go to embed, you can see that the way that that manifests is a question mark start equals 7:01. So what 7:01 is the seconds that 11:41 timestamp translates to. So 11 minutes and 41 seconds is actually 701 seconds. So I'm going to copy that instead just to show you how that operates. And I'll paste that into my scripting for this web browser URL change. So when I run my app, these still work. Go back and forth to Scotland and the bird. If I say new tutorial, then you can see that this starts not at the beginning of the video, but a portion of the way through.
Let's look at adding some narration. We're going to start with the speech bubble object.
Which that's a good tutorial if you're interested in making some interactive stories. There are other options for the embed code from YouTube that you can Google yourself, but there's different scenarios where you might want to, like we've done here, you might want to start at a specific timestamp in the video, or maybe you want it to autoplay or change the sizing or things like that. You can Google that and find those different settings yourself, but those options do work here in the web browser object for different URLs that you might want to put in there. All right, so that's the typical properties to keep in mind for a web browser object and the associated scripting with a web browser object. Happy app making!